Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Attorney General's webinar on labor trafficking, specifically designed to raise awareness among the Commonwealth's municipal officials about recognizing the signs of this crime and how to handle suspicious activity. Just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded, so I just want to disclose that up front. And if anyone is not able to hear me, please do send in a comment through the chat and we'll try to help you out. My name is Heather Rowe, and I am the Chief of Investigations for the Attorney General's Fair Labor Division, and I am joined by Beth Keeley, Chief of the Attorney General's Human Trafficking Division.
Good morning, everyone.
Just to cover a few housekeeping items, if everyone participating in this webinar this morning could be sure to put their phones on mute, that will keep out background noise for everyone on the call. But we do want to hear from you as participants today, so everyone is encouraged to submit questions during the presentation. The mechanism for submitting your questions is through the chat function of this program you're using to view the webinar. So if you look at your screen, you should see me moving my cursor, and there's an orange button here that looks like sort of a dialogue balloon. That's the chat function. So please take a moment to find the chat function on your screen as described in the login instructions, which were emailed to everyone who registered. I'd like to know more about the roles that each of our participants have within their municipalities. So if all those on the call today could please send through the chat function the department you work in or identify your role in your city or town, that would be helpful for us to know. Last fall, our two divisions started a working group in a collaborative effort to locate and prosecute crimes of forced services. While our office has a well-established track record of successful prosecutions of sex trafficking, labor trafficking cases have been more difficult to identify. And one of the factors that makes it so difficult for these cases to surface is a general lack of awareness among law enforcement and members of the public that these crimes are actually occurring in the United States and actually occurring in our state. So we have stepped up our efforts to bring victims out of the shadows and perpetrators to justice. Some of our recent efforts include a first ever training on labor trafficking at the National Cybercrime Conference for Law Enforcement in April, sponsored by Attorney General Healey. We secured the state's first indictments against a company for trafficking of persons for forced services and other related crimes in May. We're developing, in collaboration with Boston University's Migration Innovation Collaborator, SPARC, and BU School of Law's Immigration Rights and Human Trafficking Program, a labor trafficking app for first-line responders. And most recently, we reached out to all of you, the 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth, asking for your partnership to help identify, investigate, or refer suspected cases of labor trafficking that may be occurring in your communities. On behalf of Attorney General Healey, thank you for joining us this morning. We intend that this partnership with each of you will not end at the conclusion of the webinar, but serve as a mutual resource for you as local government officials and we as your Attorney General's office. On this slide, the topics that we'll cover in today's webinar. I know that some folks have just joined us, so I'd just like to remind everyone to put their phones on mute and please send questions through the chat function, and we will cover questions at the end of the presentation. And again, for anyone just joining us, this presentation is being recorded. Okay, so in today's webinar, we'll cover the scope of the issue and discuss some of the challenges with finding cases. We'll review some of the most common indicators of labor trafficking and provide you with some things to consider when dealing with victims. And we'll talk specifically about why we believe that municipal professionals may hold many of the keys to assisting law enforcement partners in the identification of trafficking victims. You are, of course, the eyes and ears in all of our communities. According to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, most calls to the trafficking hotline from Massachusetts were from victims, but a very, very close second source of calls came from members of the community. Because of the nature of your work in local government, each of you is so connected to your community, and your partnership with us in raising awareness and being provided with the resources you need to either investigate these crimes if you are law enforcement or make appropriate referrals is critical. So lastly, we will provide you with some resource and referral information that you can use, since hopefully you'll be equipped to be more attuned to suspect situations. An idea of the scope of trafficking, you will see here on this slide National statistics from the National Human Trafficking Resources Center. The NHTRC is a 24-hour, toll-free hotline funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is operated by the Polaris Project, a non-governmental anti-trafficking organization through a cooperative agreement with HHS. The NHTRC improves national efforts to protect victims of human trafficking in the United States by serving as a clearinghouse, providing callers with a range of services. The NHTRC receives community-based tips about potential trafficking situations, offers urgent and non-urgent service referrals, and provides comprehensive anti-trafficking resources and technical assistance to the anti-trafficking field and the general public. To perform these functions, the NHTRC maintains a national database of organizations and individuals working in the anti-trafficking field, as well as a library of available anti-trafficking resources and materials. Bringing it into focus for our state, you see that there have been 2,038 calls to the NHTRC hotline from 2007 to 2017, and there were 490 reports of trafficking. For 2017, 71% of the reported cases were for sex trafficking, 15% for labor, and 13% were a mix of both sex and labor, or unspecified. Data from the NHTRC are the best available data we have on reported cases of trafficking. Note, however, that these numbers do not reflect the number of incidents of trafficking or the number of trafficking victims. These are reports by victims or concerned members of the public. Beyond the reported incidents, we know there is much more activity that is simply unrecognized and unreported. These industries are the top 5 venues for reports of labor trafficking. As you can see, domestic services account for the greatest number of reported incidents. This is followed by agriculture, traveling sales crews, and I'm sure that many of you are familiar with traveling sales crews. These are entities that travel home to home or business to business selling goods such as books or subscriptions to magazines. They tend to stay for a few days to canvass an area and often have a van or vans of workers who spread out on foot knocking doors. Restaurants are also a highly susceptible industry, followed by begging rings. Again, many of you are probably familiar with these entities. They may go door to door, but more often they stake out at highly trafficked areas, both pedestrian and vehicle traffic, and represent that they are collecting donations for a charitable or humanitarian cause, such as summer camp opportunities for at-risk youth or the like. You see some additional industries where labor trafficking has presented. We encourage you to look at the typology of modern slavery at the website provided here on the slide. The Polaris Project's research team analyzed 32,000 human trafficking cases over the past 9 years, which is the largest data set on human trafficking in the United States ever compiled and publicly analyzed. The team identified 25 types of human trafficking in the U.S. and drafted a report which describes each industry business model, trafficker profiles, recruitment strategies, victim profiles, and methods of control that facilitate trafficking. As you look at these business types, we hope that things will come into focus for you as you realize how you, as a local official in your city or town, could intersect with these businesses through the course of your work. Labor trafficking is often embedded within legitimate commercial enterprises, and only by an awareness of vulnerabilities and the indicators might you be able to recognize a suspect situation that bears investigation or referral. Trafficking occurs in rural, urban, and suburban settings in different business industries. So while some communities may have more vulnerabilities than others, we know that no city or town, large or small, is immune. Workers who commonly become ensnared into a trafficking situation. There are some common characteristics of vulnerabilities that will likely come as no surprise. Some of these victims are suffering with addiction, or they owe a real or perceived debt to an employer or someone who arranged for the job. They may have uncertain immigration or documentation status. They may lack employment opportunities due to a variety of socioeconomic circumstances. There may be language or literacy barriers to being able to access legitimate employment, and they may be victims of past abuse. Labor trafficking occurs among adults and children, foreign-born, and U.S. citizens. It's widely known that immigrant workers are at a higher risk for labor trafficking victimization due to fear of deportation and the ability of a perpetrator to use documentation status as leverage. But this is not solely an undocumented worker problem. Even workers on the J-1 visa program, which are cultural exchange programs, including work and study-based programs, the H-2A visa workers in agriculture, and the H-2B visa workers for temporary or seasonal labor services are at risk for labor trafficking. According to a 2014 study by the Urban Institute and Northeastern University that looked solely at labor trafficking cases, most foreign-born trafficked workers, in fact 71%, had entered the U.S. legally, and most of them, 69%, were undocumented at the time when they left their trafficked situation. At the outset of the presentation, labor trafficking cases are hard to find, much more difficult than sex trafficking cases. We as a state need to do a better job at finding cases, seeking justice for victims, and prosecuting the perpetrators who are profiting from this crime, which means we have to recognize and overcome some of the known challenges to identifying these cases. The lack of awareness among law enforcement, prosecutors, service providers, and frontline responders is something we're trying to combat through training such as this and dissemination of information to targeted audiences. Massachusetts did not pass its own anti-trafficking law until 2011, so it's still a law that prosecutors and law enforcement are adjusting to in terms of case development. Another challenge is the conflation of trafficking with smuggling. These crimes are distinct. The shorthand way to think of both is that smuggling is a crime against the border, while trafficking is a crime against the person. The challenge by far is that indicators can be hard to spot. There is nothing inherently alarming about someone working. Traffickers are often able to maintain a facade of legitimacy, going about their business transacting with consumers who go about theirs. Recognizing victims is challenging because they may be reluctant or unable to come forward. Employers usually create a culture of fear and disorient or completely isolate workers. And there's sometimes a misconception, if you even hone in this close to a trafficking situation, that these are matters of workplace dispute, contract disagreement, or simply wage disputes. This graphic on the left-hand side of this slide looks familiar to all of you. This is the one-page reference sheet, which is a compilation of information taken from multiple sources of research on labor trafficking, which Attorney General Healey mailed to each of you, your city and town CEOs, last month, asking that it be distributed to key personnel such as building and health inspectors, code enforcement officers, assessors, licensing staff, human service staff, school department personnel, police, fire, and emergency management departments. All of you who have access in varied ways to the families, businesses, and visitors in your city or town. If you have not received a hard copy of this, you can view it, download it, and print it from the website address listed on this slide, or you can email us at labortrafficking@state.ma.us, and we can mail you copies. A little bit deeper into some common indicators of trafficking. I won't read each of these off since you can look at them while I'm speaking, but just to highlight a few points in the context of observed working conditions for potential victims. Often labor trafficking cases first surface as wage complaints or issues regarding someone's pay or lack thereof. A victim may be unable to identify his or her employer. They may experience threats or intimidation by the employer. When we at the Fair Labor Division see or hear these red flags, we know to dig a little deeper to see if there may be more than what is initially being reported, but which is articulated in different ways by victims. It is unlikely that someone would report this behavior by starting out the conversation with, "I am a victim of labor trafficking." It is through the piecing together of statements by the victim or one's own observations that the picture comes into focus, that this may be something more than what is first being presented. And here on this slide, on this slide are some potential indicators relating to someone's living conditions that may warrant further questioning or investigation. We do know that in some cultures, employer-provided housing is the norm, and that not everyone who is living in substandard living conditions is working in forced services. So none of these indicators are dispositive, and context is important. Indicators of trafficking is the lack of control a worker has over his or herself. It's important to note that while physical restraint can be an obvious indicator of forced services, restraint by robbing an individual of other means of facilitating freedom of movement or escape are probably more common, such as confiscating one's passport or controlled or no access to a person's own money or wage earnings. And of course, the way that someone presents him or herself in appearance, health, body language, and social cues would signal a problem. So again, none of these warning signs proves that a crime is being perpetrated, but by being aware of these indicators, if these flags present themselves, it may be worthy for you to dig a bit deeper into what may be going on below the surface.
The specifics of the law a little bit here. You'll see listed on this slide our Massachusetts labor trafficking statute. Our labor trafficking law contains language which actually mirrors our state sex trafficking law. That is, the knowingly, subjecting, recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, etc. But the focus here in the labor trafficking law is on a person being subjected to what we call forced services, rather than commercial sexual activity, which is what our sex trafficking law guards for. We also note that our state laws share similar language to the federal trafficking laws. However, unlike the federal trafficking laws, our laws in Massachusetts do not require us to prove force, fraud, or coercion. We think this is an important distinction. Of course, although we need to establish, especially in a labor trafficking case, one of the 6 prongs of forced services, which I'll go over in the next slide, the language of our state statutes do not require these additional elements that are required federally, force, fraud, or coercion. I'll also note that in our state statute, the criminal penalties for a person convicted of labor trafficking for forced services is very serious. The penalty is not less than 5 years in state prison. That means there's a minimum mandatory sentence of 5 years in prison for conviction under this statute. And a person could actually face up to 20 years in state prison, or life if the victim is under 18 years old. Additionally, this statute in particular envisions being applied to business entities. As you'll see, there are specifically prescribed penalties in this statute for a business. That is, up to $1 million fine. As discussed, our labor trafficking statute uses the term forced services, and that term is defined by statute, as you see here. You'll see that forced services may be established by any one of the 6 prongs that are listed. Obviously, the more forced services prongs that are present in a situation are helpful to establish that labor trafficking is taking place in a variety of ways. However, even if there is a clear violation of just one of these prongs, then we are in a position to consider whether the situation is one that rises to the level of being charged under the labor trafficking statute. Just so you know, in labor trafficking referrals we've seen at the Attorney General's office, we've encountered most often prongs 1, 3, 4, and 6. That is, we often see threats to that person or to their family. We often see threats related to a person's immigration status or a threat to call U.S. authorities on a person. We've also seen controlling of a person's passport and or legal documents, and especially have seen causing financial harm to a person. Also provide the definition of financial harm for guidance. That is, a detrimental position in relation to wealth, property, or monetary benefits because of another person's illegal acts. It's a fairly wide definition. While we don't yet have any state case law which further defines financial harm, we think it is clear through this definition that financial harm is not simply a failure to pay a person. Rather, underpayment and withholding schemes could certainly fit under this definition. Additionally, the services definition is helpful in clarifying that this does not always have to be a per se job, but labor trafficking can be established in situations where, in the simplest sense, one person is directing the efforts of another person. I'm also going to note here that through the analysis of the financial harm prong, which we just discussed, this is often where we have interplay with our state's wage and hour laws. And in fact, from the point of view of a prosecutor, I can tell you that it's this piece we see that folks most often feel able to bring forward. A person who has not received adequate pay or has been paid below what they've earned, they may feel most comfortable talking about that initially. And in fact, that scenario has been the segue for several of our joint human trafficking and Fair Labor Division investigations. From the specifics of the law to now discussing some of the intricacies of interacting with potential survivors. This and the next few slides will go over some of the things that we have learned in working with victims of trafficking, and we'd like to offer you some of these tips. Reviewing the list here, I think the biggest takeaway is the idea of trying to build trust. If we want to be in a position to hear from a potential survivor of labor trafficking, we need to understand that their willingness to disclose information will most likely be premised on whether or not they think they can trust us. As you've already heard, there are usually many barriers in place that make it difficult and complex for a survivor to believe they can entrust their story to someone else. If we recognize this, then we may be in the right place and get to the right time where a survivor's story will unfold and they will begin to relay their situation. There are some additional considerations to keep in mind. If you're getting to the point where a victim or a survivor is disclosing their situation to you, you want to consider logistics. The logistics of the situation in which you are hearing from them, questioning them, and what information to gather initially. We suggest trying for open-ended questions so that that person is able to tell the story in their words. If you're law enforcement, at this point, you definitely may be moving to a more detailed disclosure. If you're not law enforcement and you're hearing some of these details, you want to possibly think about a referral to law enforcement at this point. Immigration and cultural isolation are some of the factors which may make initial disclosure difficult and complex from the get-go. If some of these red flags have gone up, it may be that your best bet is at that point to help an individual think about safety planning, that they need to be in a safe place physically before they're in a place to disclose what their trafficking situation has been. Trauma is real, and in our work, we have learned that becoming trauma-informed and acting in accordance with an understanding of individuals who have or are experiencing trauma in their lives yields better investigations, cases, and ultimately a better dynamic with survivors, a better end result for all involved. Here you see some of those ways that trauma can impact an individual, PTSD in particular. Deportation is a fear many victims and survivors grapple with, and we've certainly seen an uptick in this fear related to deportation. What we can do is recognize that individuals are often facing these fears and threats. We can assist by connecting survivors to immigration legal advocates. These legal advocates can assist survivors in determining how they can interact with immigration authorities in a way that is not threatening and may be positive. And you'll see a list at the end of this webinar of resources which will include details on this specific kind of referral. An important program to know about when dealing with this vulnerable population, especially related to deportation concerns, is a federal program allowing for U&T visas. U non-immigrant status, also known as a U visa, is for victims of certain crimes. A T non-immigrant status, also known as a T visa, is for victims of human trafficking. U and T visas are designed to help victims of crime. This program recognizes that lack of legal immigration status in the U.S. may be among the reasons some victims choose not to come forward to work with law enforcement. We know that perpetrators and human traffickers often use victims' lack of legal status as leverage to exploit and control them. By stabilizing their status in the United States, immigration relief can be critical to providing victims of crime a greater sense of security that also makes it easier for them to assist with law enforcement and/or prosecutorial efforts. The T visa is a special option for individuals who've been victims of trafficking. In order to qualify, an individual must demonstrate that they have been cooperative with U.S. authorities, local, state, or federal. Similar to the T visa, the U visa is a special immigration status, as we discussed, that's often for victims of violent crime. There is a list of qualifying crimes. It's ideal for these survivors to have legal advocates to assist them in pursuing these special statuses. They can be pursued by a survivor at any point after they have come forward and reported their crime. And I'll also note for law enforcement, for prosecutors, we're often called upon to do these so-called certifications of these U or T visa applications. This means that your agency certifies, essentially confirming that the person you're dealing with was a victim of crime and that they have been cooperative with any investigation or resulting prosecution. It's important to note that certifying does not mean that you have granted anyone's status. Certification simply indicates to the immigration court that the person has been compliant. It is ultimately up to the immigration court, to that judge, to make an adjudication of status or not.
Seeing an overview of labor trafficking and how to deal with victims, it's probably clear to you that labor trafficking does not fit neatly into any one investigatory box. In order to evolve in our identification and prosecution of these crimes, government at all levels needs to be sharing information and working with non-governmental organization partners. These cooperative efforts will undoubtedly lead to more prosecutions and extrication of victims from forced servitude. Just last week, the Polaris Project released a report reminding us that, like any serious business owner, a successful human trafficker launches their enterprise with a well-thought-out business plan. That plan, like any successful business model, depends on an intersecting mix of legitimate industries. If human trafficking is a business requiring intense planning and depending on other businesses and partners to flourish, so too must the fight against trafficking be a collective undertaking. We all have a role in working to expose these crimes. As stated at the outset, we believe that municipal professionals may hold many of the keys to assisting law enforcement partners in the identification of trafficking victims because of the nature of your work and your unique vantage points. Through the course of your daily work, if you could keep the red flags or indicators of trafficking in your mind, many of you may find that you have opportunities for interacting with potential victims because your work has you interacting in various capacities with known high-risk industries. So if we look at the traveling sales crew businesses, your city or town may require door-to-door solicitation permits, which would require the filing of an application permit. Maybe you can require a disclosure of their intended route or target areas in your community, and maybe you could inspect and observe their activities and talk with their employees. And likely, you probably could take enforcement action if they are operating without a permit. These sales crews utilize local lodgings and restaurants. Your sanitary code inspectors may interface at either of these types of businesses, or an inspection may surface and interface with victims. Begging rings, your city or town may require general solicitation permits. And we know that with these activities, the police are often called by other businesses for so-called nuisance or trespass reasons. And this may necessitate a visit from the local PD. Through the course of talking with members engaged in the solicitation, are there any red flags that are presenting by these workers? Carnivals, because of their transient nature, are vulnerable to labor trafficking. Your city or town likely requires electrical permits for temporary hookups, or hawker, peddler, transient vendor licenses, and temporary food vendor handler permits, and sanitation inspections. By being on the fairgrounds and observing its many operations, inspectors may be able to pick up a lot about what's going on with the workforce. Domestic workers, who make up the largest percentage of reported labor trafficking cases, are particularly difficult to get access to since they are working in and are often isolated in private homes. However, city and town assessors and housing code inspectors may interact with domestic workers during a property inspection. And because domestic workers may have limited opportunities to interact with the outside world, municipal inspectors who are accessing homes may serve as a lifeline for someone who may need help. Each city or town in Massachusetts issues common victualler licenses for its restaurants. You may have commercial food permits and/or food warehouse and distributor permits. Health code inspectors and registered sanitarians see all of the back of the house personnel and operations at food service establishments and may observe red flags among restaurant or food handling staff. Every city or town has construction to varying degrees, be it residential or commercial development. Building inspectors and electrical inspectors may see suspicious activities during an inspection. In fact, just this week, we received an email from a local building inspector from a community in Bristol County who entered a business establishment and observed something that concerned him that he reported to our dedicated email address for labor trafficking tips, questions, and referrals. These may have some form of agricultural or aquacultural businesses requiring permits or inspection, such as barn permits, farming, keeping of livestock, keeping of bees. Depending on how large any harvesting operations may be, seasonal workers are often housed on the employer's premises, so there may be additional inspection opportunities for municipalities that regulate aspects of these businesses which are quite vulnerable to trafficking. Some of your communities have recreational facilities, such as amusement parks, summer camps, golf courses, and resorts. These businesses often utilize young adults working under a J-1 visa program, which has some well-documented vulnerabilities for trafficking. You may have permitting, licensing, or inspection requirements or authority that may allow you to access and observe these operations. Of course, police, fire, and emergency management, you're all our first responders in homes and businesses in both public and private property. Firefighters conduct fire prevention and fire code inspections in both public and private properties. Our community first responders professionals have an opportunity to observe many situations that undoubtedly could serve as critical intersections with victims. Additionally, they are likely to be recipients of tips, referrals, or calls for help from victims or a concerned neighbor, so it's important that they know about the crime of trafficking and the need to dig deeper based on what is being brought to them. And finally, a note about commercial cleaning. We have seen labor trafficking in the commercial cleaning industry. Some municipalities contract out their cleaning services for their municipal buildings and properties. If you're in one of these communities, you may make an effort to get to know the cleaners who move in and out of your workspaces going about their work and develop some trust.
You'll see here a slide talking about vendor and contractor compliance. We also encourage you to use your city or town's buying power to help in eradicating forced labor. Consider adding a contractor acknowledgement to your standard municipal contract that articulates your commitment to buying only lawfully produced and sourced goods and services. On this slide, you'll see a standard contract term required by anyone contracting with the Office of the Attorney General. This language is also available on our office's labor trafficking website at www.mass.gov/AGO/LT. Talked about at the beginning, we are working on a labor trafficking app. We are trying to equip you all with some 21st century tools. We're excited to let you know that our office has been working with the Boston University to create a multifunctional mobile app to provide training and resources at the fingertips of investigators and first responders. The goal of this app is to increase identification and connect victims of labor trafficking with services. The app will provide training on labor trafficking with a focus on the indicators of trafficking under Massachusetts law. The app will also provide a mechanism to connect investigators with the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, as well as local victim service providers, in order to identify resources and connect victims with services. We'll plan to send the information about the app to all of you who have registered to participate in today's webinar. And here, and on the next several slides, we've listed potential referral options, as well as some local victim service organizations for your consideration, if you get to a situation that gets to that point. On this slide, you'll see the contact information for the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. Through the NHTRC, you can talk with an advocate, get referrals for victim services, file a report of trafficking, or even email questions. We've also listed contact information for Attorney General Healey's Fair Labor Division. This is where reports of wage complaints can be filed and questions answered. As mentioned during our presentation, oftentimes these cases first surface as wage complaints. So if you're interacting with someone who's not been paid and you're unsure about trafficking, it's advisable to file the wage complaint. We've also given you the direct link to our labor trafficking webpage, which I just mentioned, and to this we continue to add content. Please check it out. We also have a labor trafficking email address if you'd like to email questions, tips, referrals, or provide any feedback or observations on this topic. And we've listed here the BU School of Law Immigrant Rights and Human Trafficking Program. This is a resource for trafficking victims in need of legal representation, and especially relates to immigration status and the UNT visa program, which we mentioned earlier. Just as a reminder, if there's a situation you encounter which is an emergency, just don't hesitate, call 911. We also want to flag that in situations of suspected labor trafficking where the potential victim is a minor under 18 years old, you may need to be calling the Department of Children and Families, DCF, and filing a 51A report. DCF will then be able to engage with that victim, that minor victim, and find appropriate resources. We've also listed here contact information directly to the Attorney General Healey's Human Trafficking Division. Note this is a non-emergency number, but if you have general information to be referred to the HTD, please call us during business hours. Next slide, we've listed a few of the victim service organizations we work with locally. I'll note here and at the top, SafeLink. If you encounter a situation where emergency shelter for a victim is an issue, this is a great place to start. On this slide, some additional victim service organizations. We also note something we have found valuable in the reports we have worked on, connecting with local cultural organizations. This can be a wealth of help and culturally competent information. We encourage you to, when appropriate, facilitate outreach to these local groups that may exist in your community as well. Resources. Here on this slide, we've listed the Office for Victims of Crime, which hosts information for individuals interested in addressing the issue of human trafficking from a variety of positions, as well as the Polaris Project website. Again, Polaris is a wealth of information and resources and considered the national leader on data and statistics and nationwide research on human trafficking for the United States. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We hope this webinar has been informative, and we hope to stay in touch with all of you on this important issue. We would now like to address your questions and comments that you've submitted. If you don't have any questions right now, please feel free to email us at the labor trafficking email that we have designated for you. That is labortrafficking@state.ma.us. Or submit questions now if you'd like to. We are still open for business to hear questions. If you want to do that through the chat function, we'd love to hear from you. Provide us with your question and or where you're submitting that from.